So this is the most boring PowerPoint you'll ever see because I really want to hear from you folks. The PowerPoints just kind of remind me just to stay on track with the different topics. So I just want to talk about different career pathways, and I want to hear your experience as well. Again, I have no financial disclosures. Things that I just want to touch on are modes of practice like academics, military, non-academic hospital-based practice, which is becoming kind of a rare bird, multi-subspecialty group, plus or minus PE, and single-subspecialty group, plus or minus PE. And just a word about solo practice, and I'd love to hear if anybody is in solo practice here, because you can take over that part of it. The only reason I'm up here is because I've had a lot of these different experiences. I was in the Army, as I said. I was in academics for 4 years after training. I was in a multi-subspecialty group, ophthalmology group that was PE-owned, and then hospital-based practice in a rural hub in Billings, Montana that served a very rural population. Now I'm in a single subspecialty group that has gone from PE to publicly owned. So again, there's no perfect job. That's the first thing I'll tell you, which of course is, just goes without saying. I think the most important thing is to rank your priorities, right, and realize that they may change over time. And my positions have changed as my priorities have changed. And so I make no apologies for it. That's just kind of life happens, right? And I think, people bemoan the state of medicine nowadays that everybody used to own their own practice, and what a great system that was. And there were a lot of benefits there. Nowadays, though, you're not necessarily stuck in one place in one job your whole life, and you actually have power to change your situation, which I think people struggled with in the past. And just in terms of priorities, pay, location, work-life balance. Do you want to be an owner, an employee? Do you want to teach and do research? And what kind of colleagues do you want? Do you want colleagues? Do you want to be alone? Like, all of these are in the mix. And when I first finished, location was the most important thing when I came out of fellowship. My wife and son were like, have fun going back to New York. We're staying here. And so that really put a pretty laser focus on what my highest priority was, which is staying here. And then that just kind of shifted over time. So a word about contracts. I would just suggest that you have an employment lawyer review, an employment lawyer who works in your state. And of course, during the contract negotiation, if you don't ask during negotiation, it's not going to happen later, right? But on the other side, the most important things in your contract, the most important things about your everyday life at any position are not in your contract. It's all about the people you work with, the people that run the organization, your relationship with them, the trust you have in the people that run the organization. Those kind of things aren't written in the contract, so I wouldn't get too hung up. And I think, no offense to anybody who has a JD-MD, but I think lawyers are really good at finding potential snags and pitfalls, and just kind of, you can just get into a morass and not really move forward. So I wouldn't go too crazy with the contract. I was in the Army, as I said. The best thing about the Army, there's no insurance or billing, so you don't have any sort of issue like that. It's even better than Kaiser from that perspective. There's no RVUs, there's no billing. All they want to know is, are you seeing people and doing a good job? You are an integrated part of the healthcare team, and I think, eye care, sometimes we feel like we're just like a sideshow, right, and not really plugged into everybody else. That's very much the opposite when you're in the military. You have super compliant patients. You actually are an officer and can give them orders, and so they have to follow what you're doing. And you can get them in trouble if they're not following orders. And so, yeah, that's kind of fun. You can have great refractive experience as an ophthalmologist. There's a warfighter refractive eye surgery program in the Army, and I'm sure there's mirror things in the Navy and the Air Force. So you get a lot of experience in that respect. For FACO, you typically will serve VA veterans in the regions where you're stationed. So it's not like you're not doing FACO. And of course, there's a lot of great cornea work to do, glaucoma work. There's a lot of trauma. These guys are great at trauma. So I think the military has a lot of pros. The cons, the pay is not really, in my mind, a con, because you're really not paying a lot to live. You're living, they're paying for you to move and all that kind of stuff. And there's good bonuses, but the pay is not as great as it could be. You have very little say in your duty station, which is important, or maybe important, particularly if you have a spouse. When I was about to go in the Army, I got a list of 7 places that I could potentially go to. Just like residency, and you had to rank them, and we had this whole strategical thing. And so we submitted our rank order. And then I got stationed in a place that wasn't on the list. So that's the needs of the Army, right? So you have very little choice. And then, of course, you can get deployed, right? And, I think in the Navy and the Air Force that it really has a somewhat of a different connotation. But when you're deployed with the Army, particularly as an optometrist, when you're embedded with a combat division, there can be mission creep, right? So we had a whole medical company of people. And you're supposed to have like a 9mm sidearm as when you're a medical officer. But we had so many medical people, they ran out. So I got an M16. Now, I am neither qualified or have the desire to be carrying around an M16. So there's kind of mission creep, right? So if you're walking around with an M16 in Iraq, you do not look like a doctor, and so you may be fired upon, and so you should probably be ready for that. And so that, I think, can lead to a real kind of moral quandary. Certainly did in my case. So the pros of academics, on the other hand, when I finished training, so that was a great position. You're working with highly skilled colleagues. There's lots of ideas and innovation around that. You're bumping into researchers. Everybody's kind of excited about their trainees. Research, I think, it can also be a con because there's a lot of funding issues now. But there's a lot of teaching going on, which makes you learn more. There's no better person to spur you to be better than your fellow or your resident. Call coverage is great because you have residents and fellows. It's kind of a nice lifestyle. There's a lot of conferences. The department can be a family in the best scenario. So I think it's a kind of a great, comfortable place, particularly when you're right out of training, as we all know, because it's kind of what we're used to. I think the academic cons, pay is plus or minus. I mean, it can be good, it can be not great. But it's somewhat of a black box. I think a lot of institutions on the academic side, when it comes to financing, are it's kind of a benign authoritarian situation. You just work hard, but you don't really know how the sausage is made in an academic setting because you have the hospital piece, you have the professional piece, and there's the research, and it's a little hard to track how things are going. Research can be a con too in terms of funding and in terms of how much time it takes from you. Teaching, also, a lot of those hours are not during your normal daytime because you're trying to see people and create a living. Of course, we're subject to federal funding whims, and you're, of course, the referral of last resort. So great place for great experience. Can be tough, though, on the lifestyle side sometimes. As I said, I went to a multi-subspecialty group. The pros there was very efficient, so higher volumes. So we're just kind of doing a lot more bread and butter and a lot less complex cases, so your productivity on an RVU basis is going up. Oftentimes, there's the internal surgery center at a multi-subspecialty practice, and so you can really have less logistical hurdles getting through an efficient day. The call can be easier because there's less trauma. You might have a screening technician or an optometrist taking first call, and overall, you're not covering. Typically, you're not covering a lot of urgent cares or ERs, so it's usually just practice call. And productivity-driven pay, it's like the American way, right? I'm working harder, I can make more money. So that all seems nice. Some of the potential downsides, particularly from a retina standpoint, the practice I was in is very much, the revenue is driven by a multifocal toric IOLs, and retina was kind of like a bolt-on. So we were not really the driver of revenue. And so when you're not the driver of revenue, you're not really getting the toys you want because you're just kind of a drag on their system, right? The only way the retina is bringing money to the practice is drugs. And if you are new to the practice, you're generating drug revenue, but you're not necessarily sharing in that. So I think the other challenging part of multi-subspecialty when you're the one of one on the retina side is that all of the disasters kind of come your way, and you can't really share that with anybody, so you get a lot of that burden. So that could be a little bit tough. Hospital-based practice. By the way, my guess is there's a lot of people who are multi-subspecialty practice. Is that right? Anybody multi-subspecialty practice? Oh, very much fewer than I anticipated. Okay, great. Did I miss anything on the multi-subspecialty? Anything to add there? Not so much. Okay. So hospital-based practices, I think this is a kind of a dying breed, but it has some interesting benefits. Again, you're integrated part of a healthcare team, like in academics and like in the military. You get really interesting consults, particularly in Billings. We had it was a rural healthcare system. They're coming from ranches hundreds of miles away with kicked by a horse and all kinds of fun stuff. It's kind of the benefit of academics without the teaching and research responsibility, so you can be more productive and efficient because you're not explaining everything you're doing to somebody, which is kind of nice. And typically there's a high guaranteed pay during your first contract. So a lot of these big hospital systems that have ophthalmologists, they have a hard time bringing people on, particularly if they're not in a big metro area. And so you can start out making really good money right off the bat, and the hospital will kind of front any ramp-up time. They'll eat that cost, which is somewhat nice if you have a lot of student loans. The downside, though, you're relying on the hospital infrastructure to allow you to ramp up. And so if they're not going to support you with staff, space, surgical time, et cetera, you may not become as productive as they're paying you. And when your guaranteed salary contract runs out, you may take a pay cut. And I saw this quite a bit in Billings. People would come for 2 years. They would not, and it's not just in ophthalmology, almost every subspecialty, they would not really earn their pay by the time their 2 years was up, and then the hospital would offer them a second contract quite a bit lower, with the hopes that you've settled, made roots, and stay. So it almost became like a teaser salary, right? And I think that's unfortunate. So I was able to kind of make my pay, and I think it was fine, but I think that strategy just leads to churn among doctors and lots of young people without a lot of institutional kind of knowledge. And again, in a big hospital system, ophthalmology can really be an afterthought. So in terms of space, surgical toys, all those kind of technology, staffing, they don't see you as the big revenue driver, so they're not as interested necessarily as kind of funding your productivity. And the call, quite honestly, that was the most difficult part about being in Billings. The call was worse than residency call, but I was the resident. There was nobody else. So when you're on call, like you're taking first call, you're taking call from all these urgent cares all over the state, and Wyoming and everything. So that's the potential downside for sure in one of these big hospital systems. Single subspecialty group practice, I think it's probably the highest efficiency and productivity model. Everybody is kind of rowing in the same direction. So capital expenditures, I think, there's less argument about that. People kind of want the same toys. They want to make the same investments. At least for the most part, I think people are more on the same page. There's shared urgent coverage. All that is kind of spread over more people. There's more equivalent overhead usage. So I think, when there's glaucoma and cornea and plastics and retina, your use of overhead can be vastly different, and so that could lead to challenging discussions about how that should be parsed out and paid for. But I think when it's one subspecialty, it's kind of easier to make things equitable. People surprise you. It's not always easy, but I think it's easier in this setting. Call can be as manageable as the practice makes it. And again, if you're all in the same subspecialty, I think you're more likely to want the same things when it comes to what your call coverage should be, how should it be pre-screened. And I think we've, in our group, have created just a really great call situation with technicians and screeners, et cetera. Because everybody is going to be on call, and you all kind of want to sleep. I think the potential downside of this model is competition. Depending on your comp model, there can be internal competition for cases, or internal competition for types of patients and payer mixes. Like all these kind of things have to be discussed in pretty good detail. Otherwise, it could lead to conflict. Not to give any secrets away, we have a pretty good model where basically it's just revenue, RVU based, and so you don't get a higher credit for seeing a better patient mix in terms of payer. And so that just leads people to kind of, take what's there and not try and cherry pick. I think those kind of situations can really give younger associates a bad taste if you feel like you're just getting the lower paying kind of payer mix. Private equity can dominate these larger markets in these single subspecialty groups. And as a provider, you're kind of trading that scale and dominance locally versus future profit. Like that's kind of the model, right? You're kind of giving up potential profits in the future for being part of a large group that can scale their buying costs and their cost of doing business. And so there's pluses and minuses there. On the other hand, non-PE groups can have an onerous buy-in, right? And I think our young guys, and I count myself as a young person, I started 10 years later. So like my contemporaries are like 9 years behind my training. Right? The people that I train with are about 9 years younger, so I still think I'm young, which is great. But our mentality is that you're kind of funding a partner's retirement. But a lot of us feel like we don't know that is necessarily going to be the case when it's our turn to retire. So I think onerous buy-ins are a big turnoff for younger people coming out, particularly if you have a lot of medical school debt. I think that's something that really makes it hard for people to stomach a big, long, expensive buy-in. And then, the high volume, high productivity model is great, but you have to be careful that it doesn't lead to burnout. And I think the best groups have a good call model, have a good PTO model, and these things so that, it's more sustainable. But that's, I think, a potential downside. And then, just in terms of local competition, when you're the big person in town, the biggest group in town, you're kind of everybody else's target. And so I think, on the one hand, that kind of keeps you on your toes and keeps you at your best, but it does, in some sense, put a target on your back. Anybody here in solo practice? So a couple of people, great. So please let me know what I'm missing here, but my very good friends in solo practice, I think the goals here, the best part of it is you can create your dream practice, you can be your own boss, you can learn and understand all of the business that happens in ophthalmology. You're actually making those decisions. So you really own that, which is, I think there's a sense of ownership and pride that comes with that. You get to make all the decisions. You get to live with all the decisions. You get to keep more of your gross income. My good friend is in solo private practice in retina in Florida. And after patient 12, he is basically it's just gravy. The first 12 patients are paying his staff and overhead. So he doesn't have to see all that many. And he can see as many as he wants or as little as he wants, whatever makes him feel comfortable. And nobody's really driving that except him, which is, I think, a huge plus. But the startup costs, again, they're formidable. Again, not to keep banging the same drum, but a lot of us people these days have a lot of medical school debt and undergrad debt. It's really hard to think about opening your own practice. And you cannot share the costs of billing, coding, electronic health records, HR, MIPS, all these things are just being borne by one person. It can really, really be onerous. And then you're only one person, so the higher cost of goods, so your IOLs, your drugs, all those things, it's very hard to negotiate for better purchasing power when you're only one person. You're covering your practice 24/7. You might well be covering community hospital ER calls so that you can build your practice. So I think you need to be available almost all the time, which again, if you're a fixture in the community or seeking to become that, that's the way to do it. But it can be challenging. And everything falls on you, the good and the bad. Anything about solo practice that you would add, solo practitioners? Good.
In our practice, it's nice to be, when you were saying you get to have your dream job or you get to do it the way you want to, I mean, you can have Bibles out, you can have, you can really tailor you can decorate your office any way you want. And that's really been special. And I think for myself, once you kind of get past that hurdle of those up cost, try to use as many part-time people as you can, like in your surgery center. I actually have a one-room surgery center too. It took time. My way was actually a little different than some. I had the hospital brought me into the rural area and paid a lot of my debt off. Also offered me some good income in the first few years, but that only was 5 years. After the 5 years, you could be more independent. But it has its pluses and minuses, especially on buying equipment. You have to really pick and choose what is most critical. to have, and maybe in your community, if you have optometrists who might have an Optos, share that with them if you don't want to invest in that particular machine. So it's a lot of decisions, but you can call your shots, and that's nice. That's really nice.
I'm also going to add that you're involved a lot in the business part of it, not just the medical part, and that can present a lot of its own challenges. But it is wonderful because you can make all your own decisions, and it falls back on you.
Yeah, and I see like at the AEO and the meetings, ASRS, you can kind of tell who really is running their own practice because their questions about any of the business topics are just so pointed and using vocabulary that I don't even have. I'm like, wow. I'm like, so I think that's one thing I really did not have the opportunity to avail myself of. It was sort of that sort of entrepreneurship business mindset that I think solo practice or group practice really gives you. But I think, it just goes to, we should really tailor our practices to our strengths and our priorities. For me, I kind of came full circle. I came back to Denver mostly because I wanted to be with great colleagues again. I was really tired of being in a rural outpost as the only retina person and just kind of taking a pounding. And the pay was great, but what's it for? You know what I mean? It doesn't make a difference at the end of the day. It's just very much more fruitful to be in a practice where, we have a text chain about different cases. We have case conferences about our hard cases. We just kind of go over things, and it's really, really nice. And for me, it's made retina just much more fulfilling again. That's about all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions or hear anyone else's input about what their practice situation is like. I would just leave you with the thought of, again, if you don't like what you're doing, change it. I think that's the one nicer thing in the modern era, that aside of our solo practitioners, it's relatively easy to make a change if you need to.
Any questions? Abe?
So one other category that I do think deserves mention is the VA, which is kind of its own beast.
Yep.
And having simmered in that system for the last 10 years, I can tell you it does certainly have its own pros and cons. Though I do feel that it's probably pretty similar to a lot of the pros and cons in military practice. You don't necessarily get a lot of input into the day-to-day decisions that, affect how you treat your patients and how you work. You don't get a lot of choice in who you're working with, but you're not really worried about day-to-day concerns with, insurance company and billing and things along those lines. But you have to deal with a lot of really baffling decision-making.
Yes. Right. I would agree. And it's kind of the best of the military, but they're not going to send you somewhere else, which is kind of nice. And I love I just obviously have a special place in my heart for the VA population. And these are, when I go to the VA and I get treated there, and you just kind of feel like you're back in the Army for good or for bad. So it's a really important part of our social safety net here in the U.S. And I think there's a question in the back as well.
Yeah. You're Peter.
Just mostly for our younger guys in the room, one extra component to consider is just not just where you're working or what environment, but who you're working with and where their priorities are, particularly from a spiritual perspective. Worked in different practices, certainly secular practices. I work with Christians who don't bring their faith to practice, or at least the practice is not focused specifically on Christian ideals, or in a Christian practice that attempts to intertwine their Christian faith with their business, which is very difficult to do. None of them are perfect. They all have people making real life decisions, and some of these things are tough when you're asking other people to take your call or compromise their salary or anything else, but there's some important points there. And then also, just from a personal perspective, you never know what you're going to get called to later. So as you said, your first practice may not be your last practice, but you may also get called to spend more time away. So does the practice you're looking at accommodate that? Do they accommodate missions or stepping away for something other than just your vacation time? And then personally, are your decisions driving what your practice needs are? Or can you allow your practice to facilitate where you're headed spiritually? So it's never a bad idea to pay off debt and put away money. putting away kids' college funds and other things, get some of those things in place, and then you have some freedom to make some other choices.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point because, our practice is coming up with models to like keep people on board in a more sustainable way. So I think a lot of us, you're just working full time and then the path has been just like, then you're retired. It's like 100 or 0. I think that's going to be hard to maintain in our country because of the lack of what we do, lack of people doing what we do. And also is really hard on us too to all of a sudden have a completely different life. So I think there's going to be more push for practices finding ways for people to work in, either less time, maybe combining to make a full-time equivalent, or having more time to do things that are important to them, but taking a pay cut, but not completely retiring. I think that's a really, really great thing that's starting to happen, and I think it will hopefully only continue.
I was going to make a comment that in private practice, whether you participated in PE or not, it really totally changed the landscape in terms of how your thought processes and how your practice is going to be transitioned or whatever. And then just as you said, so you're trying to make this equitable for both sides because obviously the money is real for those who are owning their practice as to what's available out there. But they all want what's best for the practice. I mean, I do think that for the most part, people want to see their practice succeed. They want to be able to recruit, quality physicians, and we know that can be a challenge to sell and then recruit good physicians sometimes in certain places. So our practice has dealt with that. Just the money's real for my senior partners. Look, they're giving up a lot of money to not go private equity, but at the same time, that's not real dollars for those who are trying to buy in. They can't afford that. So trying to find this fair balance between the two of them has been a challenge for us, number one. And then number two, as you were stating, like the new generation of physicians don't necessarily want to work the same that some of these guys and ladies did. And so some of them are looking for more part-time deals, or you're trying to figure out this balance of how do you transition this practice and maintain equitably for everyone. And so if you have any comments about that, I mean, it's just been a challenge.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm a Gen X person who trained with millennials, so I kind of see both sides. And I think the reality is like, we all someday want to retire. We all want a fruitful practice in the here and now too. And for the people that have built up these practices and invested their blood, sweat, and tears for 30 years, like there should be a mechanism to allow them to offload that in a way that gives them a good sense of remuneration for their life's work. And the people coming on should be able to take that on in a way that doesn't completely mortgage their future in a way that prevents them from having a life now. So I think it's a lot of give and take, and I think there may be creative ways to solve that with, as you said, not everybody is going to want to work as hard as the people that founded the practice, but there are some that will. But I think there's a role for everybody, and it's just finding a way that everybody can contribute and be paid in a way that's equitable and have an equity stake plus or minus. I think we're going to need to be creative about it because otherwise these practices have no other route to go besides private equity, because that's the only people with the resources to kind of actually give a really great valuation for people. So it's really hard to judge people for selling to private equity when otherwise their junior partners or their associates, don't have the means to do it. Like, what are they supposed to do? Just walk away? So I would say there's a group in Portland, Maine, that had a really innovative way. And they basically made the company for lack of a better term, like a co-op. And the company's owned by this retirement fund, and everybody who works there has shares in this fund. And I can't explain it better than that. There's a word, it's a very specific tax structure that it has. But it's the CEO of the company is going around and talking about it all over the country because it's basically the only way they found that they could not sell the private equity and make everybody reasonably happy. But even the people at the front desk, they all kind of have shares in this fund. And it's based upon seniority and all these other things. But they found a way to do it that I would say all of the doctors I talk to there are absolutely thrilled. So I guess my point is there are ways if we are creative enough. And I think we're super smart people that have tons of training, and we shouldn't cede all of the hard work to outside entities if we can figure out a way to do it ourselves.
One final quick question, then we've got to go.
Okay, so actually 3 things. I'd like to meet you afterwards. I had a career in the Army as ophthalmology, so just a few things for military medicine that you may have covered, but I didn't pay attention to. But you can serve in a military hospital and not be on active duty. So you can be a GS employee and still see patients.
That's a great
If
point,
you want to be
yeah.
clinical. So that is another opportunity. Some people, second careers, and if you want to slow down but still stay clinical. And not all are teaching hospitals. You can be in community hospitals. So in the military also, there are more opportunities for leadership at a much younger age. And so you'd be in charge of committees and stuff like that. And when you're just really starting out your clinical practice, you're often given or told opportunities to take leadership roles. So after my fellowship, I came back to a teaching hospital, and I was like the director of the glaucoma service, right? And I was just out of fellowship. So example of opportunities. And then military-wise, if you do retire, if you do state of retirement, it could be a $2 to $3 million annuity given some assumptions, but that's just another plug for military medicine.
Yeah, that's great points. Thank you.
We want to thank you for your talks today. They were great.
Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation coming out. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You bet.